The morning unfolded slowly, as if the land itself were reluctant to disturb what lay hidden beneath the tall, whispering grass. The rangers moved in a loose line, boots brushing softly against dry stems, eyes scanning for signs that most people would never notice. A broken blade bent at an unnatural angle. A faint trail pressed into the dust, the suggestion of something small having passed through and then stopped. It was one of them who first paused, raising a hand gently, drawing the others into stillness without a word. There, half concealed by shadow and grass, lay the cub. He was stretched on his side, his small body rising and falling in shallow, uneven movements. Each breath seemed to arrive late, as though his lungs were hesitating before remembering their purpose. His tawny fur was dulled with dust, clinging in places where moisture had once been. One hind leg was drawn slightly inward, held in a way that suggested discomfort, though he did not shift to ease it. His ears twitched once, faintly, then settled again. The air around him felt suspended. No distant roar. No answering call. No sign of a protective presence waiting nearby. The rangers lowered themselves slowly, knees pressing into warm earth. No one reached out. No one spoke at first. They watched the rhythm of his breathing, the subtle movement of his ribs, the fragile persistence of life still working inside him. His eyes were half open, unfocused, reflecting pale light without tracking it. When a fly settled near his muzzle, he did not lift his head to chase it away. Only a weak flick of skin passed over his nose. One ranger shifted closer, careful to keep his shadow from falling across the cub's face. He murmured quietly, almost to himself, "It's okay, little one." The words floated briefly in the air, then dissolved into the surrounding grass. The cub responded only with a faint sound, something between a breath and a low, uncertain vibration. His chest tightened for a moment, then loosened again. The effort seemed to drain him. His tongue, dry and pale, slipped slightly from between his lips before retreating. Dehydration revealed itself in small, unmistakable ways. The tightness of skin. The lack of moisture around the eyes. The sluggishness that weighed on every movement. There were marks along his flank, shallow scratches that might have come from thorns, or from the hurried passage through dense brush. One shoulder bore a darker patch where fur had been flattened and matted, hinting at a fall or impact that had gone unnoticed in the chaos of separation. The grass around him swayed gently in the breeze, brushing against his body like distant, indifferent hands. Somewhere far off, birds called in slow intervals, unaware of the fragile moment unfolding below. Another ranger leaned in slightly and whispered, "You're still with us." It was not encouragement meant for the cub alone, but for everyone kneeling beside him. They searched the horizon with quiet urgency, eyes tracing ridges and open plains for any sign of a returning mother. Nothing moved except heat and wind. No dust clouds. No silhouettes. No answering calls. The realization settled gradually, heavy but unspoken. Whatever had brought him here, he was alone now. The cub shifted at last, lifting his head by a few trembling centimeters before letting it fall back into the grass. His breath stuttered, then steadied. Around him, the tall stems whispered softly, bending and rising with the afternoon wind, carrying away the warmth of the day and holding, for a moment longer, the fragile rhythm of a life that had not yet learned how close it stood to disappearing. Time moved differently after the first discovery, stretching and thinning beneath drifting clouds and slow, steady wind. The rangers remained where they were, settled into quiet positions a short distance from the cub, careful not to disturb the fragile balance that still held him in place. They had chosen patience over intervention, guided by experience and restraint. If his mother was alive, if she was searching, any sudden movement could break the delicate thread that might still bring her back. The cub lay mostly still, though small changes passed through him like distant waves. One forepaw flexed weakly, claws emerging and retreating without purpose. His tail shifted once, brushing against dry stems that whispered softly in response. Every few minutes, his breathing deepened slightly, then slipped back into its shallow rhythm, as if he were borrowing strength in brief, uncertain installments. As the sun climbed, warmth gathered around his small body. Heat shimmered faintly above the ground. The smell of dust and grass thickened in the air. Insects hummed lazily, settling and lifting without consequence. The cub's ears twitched now and then, responding to sounds too distant or faint for human ears to separate. At one point, his head lifted again, trembling under its own weight. His mouth opened, releasing a thin, fragile sound, not a roar, not even a proper call, but something closer to a breath shaped by need. It faded quickly, swallowed by wind and space. He tried once more, weaker than before, then rested his chin against the earth. One ranger shifted his weight slowly and whispered, "Easy, easy." The words were barely more than breath. No one moved closer. They watched the horizon in long, silent sweeps. Every shadow, every distant flicker of movement was examined and released. Clouds gathered briefly, softening the light, then drifted apart again. The land offered no answers. No approaching form. No distant call. No ripple of grass that suggested a large body passing through. Hours accumulated quietly. With each passing stretch of stillness, the absence of the lioness grew heavier. It pressed into the space around them, filling what should have been marked by her presence. There were no fresh tracks leading back. No broken branches. No signs of recent movement large enough to belong to her. Only older impressions blurred by wind and time. The cub's body began to show the cost of waiting. His breaths became slightly more irregular. A faint tremor passed through his flank, then settled. His eyes opened wider for a moment, cloudy and unfocused, before drifting closed again. When he shifted, it was slower now, as if each movement had to be carefully negotiated with exhaustion. One ranger leaned closer to another and murmured, "She should have been back by now." The words were soft, weighted with worry rather than certainty. The wind brushed through the grass in slow waves, folding and unfolding around the small form at its center. Light shifted across his fur, then slipped away. Somewhere far off, a herd moved, their distant rhythm barely audible. Still no mother appeared. And as afternoon leaned quietly toward evening, the fragile calls faded into silence, leaving only breath, wind, and the growing understanding that something somewhere had gone wrong. As the afternoon stretched onward, the quiet around the cub began to feel less like waiting and more like watching something slowly slip away. The rangers noticed the change in him before it announced itself clearly. His breaths no longer followed a steady rhythm. They came in shallow clusters, then paused as if he were forgetting for a moment how to continue. His body remained pressed into the earth, seeking whatever coolness still lingered beneath the surface. They understood then that patience alone was no longer enough. Without urgency in their movements, without breaking the calm they had protected for hours, one ranger reached slowly into his pack. The sound of fabric shifting was soft, almost apologetic. Another eased closer, placing each knee carefully, testing the ground before committing his weight. Their bodies formed a loose barrier against the sun, creating a narrow strip of shade that settled gently over the cub's head and shoulders. A small container appeared in careful hands. Water caught the light briefly before being lowered out of view. The ranger tilted it just enough for a few drops to gather along its edge. He did not force it toward the cub's mouth. Instead, he waited, holding still, allowing the scent and sound to reach him first. After several seconds, the cub stirred. His nose twitched faintly. His tongue emerged, slow and uncertain, brushing against dry lips. One drop touched it and disappeared. He paused, then licked again, this time with slightly more intention. Another drop followed. Then another. His throat moved in a weak swallow, visible beneath thinning fur. Someone whispered, "That's it, good," barely louder than the wind. They continued this way, offering only what he could manage. No hands restrained him. No movements hurried him. When his head slumped, they waited. When he lifted it again, trembling, they adjusted slightly, keeping the water within reach but never pressing it forward. Gradually, small signs of response appeared. One foreleg shifted outward, no longer curled tightly beneath his body. His tail flicked once, then rested. His ears, which had flattened in fatigue, lifted slightly, catching nearby sounds. His eyes opened more often now, still unfocused, but aware enough to linger on the shapes around him. Shade deepened as clouds passed overhead. A jacket was carefully unfolded and positioned to extend the shelter. The fabric barely brushed his fur. He did not recoil. Instead, he leaned faintly into its edge as if accepting its presence without fully understanding it. At one point, he released a soft sound, low and brief, not a call for his mother but something quieter, shaped by contact and comfort. A ranger answered with a whisper, "You're safe." The cub's breathing eased just slightly. The pauses shortened. The clusters smoothed into something closer to rhythm. He shifted his weight and managed to tuck his paws beneath himself, a small act that required effort he had not shown earlier. Around them, the land continued its indifferent motion. Grass swayed. Insects passed. Light changed. Yet within that wide, unfeeling landscape, something fragile and rare was forming. Not ownership. Not dominance. Not control. Only patience meeting instinct. Only quiet presence answering quiet survival. And in that narrow space between human restraint and animal trust, The cub rested, suspended between what he had lost and what he might still reach. Evening arrived without ceremony, slipping into the sky in muted layers of gold and gray. The heat loosened its grip on the land, and the air cooled in quiet increments. Shadows stretched longer through the grass, gathering around the small circle where the cub lay beneath borrowed shade and careful watch. He had grown still again. Not with the alarming stiffness of earlier hours, but with the heavy stillness of exhaustion that follows effort. His breathing remained present, thin but steady. His eyes opened only briefly now, fluttering and closing as if light itself had become too much to carry. The rangers stayed close, their bodies relaxed but alert. No one spoke. The day had narrowed their world to this one fragile form and the uncertain promise of night. Then, almost imperceptibly, the grass shifted. At first, it seemed no different from the countless movements the wind had made all afternoon. A ripple passed, then another. But this one carried weight, direction, intention. One ranger noticed first. His head lifted slightly, eyes fixing on a darker line forming in the reeds. Something was coming. The movement slowed, then resumed. Stems parted carefully, not broken, but pressed aside by a body that had learned to move without drawing attention. A pale shape emerged, then resolved into muscle, bone, and scarred fur. The lioness stepped into view. Her frame was thinner than it should have been, ribs faintly visible beneath her coat. One foreleg favored the ground, landing lightly before shifting her weight away again. Along her flank, dried blood marked an old wound, dark against tawny fur. Her breathing was deep and labored, chest rising with effort. She stopped several meters away. Her head lifted. Her gaze locked onto the cluster of humans beside her cub. The air changed. Muscles tensed beneath her skin. Her tail stiffened slightly. Every instinct pressed forward at once. Protect, drive away, reclaim, defend. She did not growl. She did not charge. She simply stood, unmoving, reading the scene before her. The rangers did not move. No hands reached for tools. No bodies shifted into defensive lines. They remained as they were, low and quiet, eyes soft, posture open. One whispered, "She's here," not in triumph but in relief. The cub stirred. At the sound and scent of his mother, something deep within him responded. His head lifted weakly. A thin, trembling sound escaped his throat, barely more than breath shaped into need. The lioness took one step forward. Then another. Slowly, carefully, she closed the distance, never breaking eye contact with the humans. Each step seemed weighed against memory and fear. Each movement carried the calculation of survival. She stopped again, now close enough to see the water container, the shade, the fabric resting near her son. She watched. Listened. Smelled. Nothing here spoke of harm. After a long moment, her shoulders lowered. Her posture softened. She moved past the rangers without aggression, without submission, only resolve. Lowering herself beside the cub, she curved her body around him, creating a living barrier. Her tongue reached out, rough and deliberate, brushing dust from his face, tracing his ears, his neck, his ribs. The cub pressed weakly into her warmth. One ranger murmured, "She trusts him to us," almost to himself. But it was more than trust. It was choice. In the fading light, beneath cooling skies, an injured mother set aside fear and instinctive caution. She accepted unfamiliar presence for the sake of one small, breathing life. And as dusk deepened and the grass whispered around them, the land bore quiet witness to a rare truce, born not of control but of devotion. Night settled gently over the plain, not as a sudden darkness, but as a gradual softening of color and sound. The last traces of gold slipped from the horizon, replaced by pale blue and quiet gray. In that thinning light, the lioness remained curled around her cub, her body forming a protective arc against the cooling air. He had shifted closer to her side. With slow, deliberate movements, she adjusted her position, guiding him beneath her chest. Her breathing was steady now, deep and anchoring. When he found her, it was with small, searching motions, nose brushing against her fur, mouth opening and closing uncertainly. She remained still, allowing him time to settle. At last he latched on. The change was subtle but unmistakable. His body relaxed. His limbs loosened. The tightness that had held him for days began to release, one breath at a time. Soft, rhythmic movements passed through his throat as he drank, drawing strength from the only source that had ever truly belonged to him. The lioness lowered her head and rested her chin lightly against his back. Her eyes half closed, though they never fully surrendered to sleep. Every few moments, her ears shifted, tracking distant sounds. Her tail flicked once, then stilled again. The rangers watched from several steps away. No one spoke. They had already begun to fade themselves from the scene, inch by inch, breath by breath. One by one they eased backward, careful not to disturb the fragile calm. A jacket was quietly retrieved. A container slipped back into a pack. Knees straightened slowly. Weight shifted with restraint. Their presence had served its purpose. Now it was time to leave. When the last ranger stepped away, the grass closed gently behind him as if erasing the path. Soon, only the lioness and her cub remained at the center of the clearing, wrapped in shadow and quiet connection. The cub continued to nurse, stronger now, more certain. His paws pressed faintly against his mother's side in slow, instinctive motions. His breathing deepened. Between swallows, he paused, resting his head against her fur, then returned again. Above them, stars emerged one by one. The night carried on. In the days that followed, no one saw them again. There were no more fragile calls. No small form lying motionless in the grass. No signs of struggle. Only tracks. Light paw prints beside larger ones, crossing damp earth near a water source. Impressions where two bodies had rested briefly in shade. Faint trails leading toward thicker cover, then disappearing into the vast weave of the land. They were easy to miss. But to those who knew where to look, they were unmistakable. Proof that something had survived. Proof that patience had mattered. Proof that, for a brief stretch of time, fear and instinct and human restraint had aligned in service of a single fragile life. And long after the grass had risen and fallen over those passing marks, the memory of that quiet reunion lingered, like the last warmth of sunset fading slowly into night.